There's a stack of envelopes on a kitchen counter somewhere right now, and nobody in that house has opened them in weeks. They walk past it every single day. They see it out of the corner of their eye every single morning, and somehow they still don't touch it. Welcome back to Slow Down with Brenda. We're going to sit with something a lot of us carry quietly, the way we relate to money, and more specifically, the way we avoid looking at it. Not because we're careless, not because we don't understand numbers, but because underneath all of it, there's something a lot harder to admit out loud. We're afraid of what we'll find. Maybe you know this feeling, that envelope you keep meaning to open, that banking app you haven't checked in longer than you'd like to say out loud, that small wave of dread that shows up the second someone says the word budget. It's easy to call this a discipline problem, to tell ourselves that if we just tried harder, pushed harder, we'd finally have it together. But what if that's not it at all? What if the real story here was never really about the numbers? What if it was about the feelings we've never had permission to sit with? We think avoidance means we're lazy. We think it means we don't care enough to fix it. It's usually the opposite. Avoidance is often a form of protection. When something feels too heavy to look at directly, we look away instead. Not because we're careless, because caring in that moment feels unbearable. There's a story that captures this so clearly. A woman who built her whole identity around being good with money. She was raised by parents who taught her to save early, and for a long time, she believed she had it figured out. Then, somewhere in her mid-20s, it all came apart at once. A financial scam took a large piece of her savings. A recession took her job. A mortgage she could no longer keep up with took her home. She ended up back in her childhood bedroom, in the same small bed she slept in as a kid, crying quietly enough that no one else in the house would hear. And what hurt more than the debt itself was a voice in her head that kept whispering that she was a failure, that she should have known better. That voice didn't come from her parents. It didn't come from her bank. It came from somewhere inside her. Maybe that's the part we don't talk about enough. Shame doesn't just sit quietly with us. It isolates us. It convinces us we're the only ones struggling, that everyone else has this figured out, that saying the truth out loud would only make it worse. But shame only survives in silence. By the end of today, we want you to understand. Sometimes the hardest part isn't facing the numbers. It's facing what we've quietly started believing about ourselves because of them. That may be where this conversation really begins. When that woman finally told one trusted friend what had happened, she wasn't looking for someone to rescue her. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't hoping for a perfect solution. She simply couldn't carry the silence anymore. And something unexpected happened. Nothing about her bank account changed that day. Her debt didn't disappear. She didn't suddenly find a new job. The practical problems were still waiting for her the next morning. But she no longer felt like she had to hide. Sometimes that's the first thing that changes before anything else does. Not our circumstances, our loneliness. We often underestimate how much energy it takes to pretend everything is fine. We answer, "I'm good." We change the subject. We smile. We keep showing up. Meanwhile, there's a part of us that's quietly exhausted from protecting a secret that doesn't actually need protecting. Maybe you've experienced something similar. Not necessarily with money. Perhaps it was a relationship that wasn't going well. A health concern you didn't want to talk about. A mistake you kept replaying in your mind. Or simply a season where life felt heavier than anyone around you realized. Whatever it was, you may remember how isolating it felt. Not because no one cared. Because shame has a way of convincing us that nobody could possibly understand. That's one of shame's quietest tricks. It doesn't usually shout. It whispers. It tells us that everyone else has figured life out. that everyone else knows something we somehow missed, that if people really knew what was going on inside our lives, they would see us differently. And after hearing that whisper long enough, we begin treating it like the truth. But a thought repeated many times is still just a thought. It isn't necessarily reality. We sometimes think shame comes from making a mistake, but more often it comes from attaching that mistake to our identity. Missing a payment becomes, I'm irresponsible. Losing a job becomes, I'm not capable. Making a poor financial decision becomes, I'm terrible with money. Notice how quickly our minds stop describing an event and start defining a person. That's a heavy burden for anyone to carry. Because events can change, identity feels permanent. Maybe that's why so many of us avoid looking at the very thing that hurts. Not because we're unwilling to deal with it, because every glance seems to confirm a painful story we've already been telling ourselves. If opening the banking app feels like opening evidence against yourself, of course you'll hesitate. If every bill feels like another reminder that you're failing, avoidance begins to make a strange kind of sense. It isn't laziness, it's self-protection. Our minds are remarkably good at protecting us from emotional pain, even when the protection creates new problems later. We see this in so many parts of life. Someone postpones a medical appointment because they're afraid of bad news. Someone avoids checking their email because they're worried about criticism. Someone delays an important conversation because they don't know how it will end. The situations are different. The emotional pattern is often the same. When something feels overwhelming, distance feels safer than contact, for a little while. The difficulty is that avoidance rarely stays small. It quietly grows. Not always because the situation becomes dramatically worse. Sometimes the situation hardly changes at all. What changes is the story our imagination keeps writing while we stay away from it. Without real information, our minds fill in the blanks, usually with the worst possible version. A 5-minute task becomes something we've dreaded for 5 weeks. A conversation becomes a disaster before it has even happened. A bill becomes impossible before we've actually looked at the number. Fear has a remarkable imagination, and unlike reality, imagination doesn't have to follow facts. Maybe you've noticed this before. You finally do the thing you've been avoiding for days, or even months. Afterward, you don't necessarily feel happy, but you often wonder why it seemed so impossible before. The task was uncomfortable, just not as unbearable as your mind predicted. There's an important difference between those two words. Uncomfortable asks us to stay present. Unbearable tells us to run. Sometimes we've been responding to discomfort as though it were danger. Our nervous system doesn't always know the difference, especially if we've lived through seasons where uncertainty genuinely felt unsafe. That's why kindness matters here. Not because kindness magically solves financial problems. Because criticism rarely helps a frightened mind think clearly. Think about how we speak to someone we love. If a close friend came to you and said, I made a financial mistake, would your first response be, you're hopeless? Probably not. You'd likely ask what happened. You'd want to understand the story before offering advice. You'd remind them that one chapter doesn't define an entire life. It's interesting how naturally we extend that compassion to other people, and how difficult it can be to offer even a small piece of it to ourselves. Maybe we believe being harder on ourselves will make us improve faster. But for many of us, it simply makes us hide longer. Understanding creates movement. Judgment often creates paralysis. That's why this conversation isn't really about becoming tougher. It's about becoming more honest. Honest enough to say, I'm scared. Honest enough to admit, I've been avoiding this. Honest enough to recognize that avoiding something doesn't make us weak. It makes us human. And once we can say that without attacking ourselves, something quietly shifts. We stop fighting who we are. We become curious instead. Curiosity is surprisingly powerful. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" we begin asking, "What was I trying to protect?" Those two questions lead to very different places. One ends with shame. The other begins with understanding. Maybe that's the doorway we've been looking for all along. Not confidence, not perfect discipline, just enough honesty to stay with ourselves for one more moment than we usually do. Because the goal isn't to become fearless before taking the next step. The goal is simply to discover that fear doesn't have to make every decision for us. And sometimes, the smallest act of courage isn't solving the entire problem. It's sitting beside it without looking away. Once we stop seeing money as proof of our worth, we finally have room to understand it. And understanding almost always begins with something much simpler than we expect. Not with a complicated spreadsheet, not with an ambitious financial plan, just with paying gentle attention to what has been there all along. When we feel anxious about money, it's surprisingly easy to believe that we need to fix everything immediately. We imagine sitting down one evening and somehow organizing every account, every expense, every goal, every mistake all at once. No wonder we keep putting it off. The task we've imagined is simply too big. But what if it didn't have to begin there? What if the first step was small enough that it didn't scare us away? Imagine sitting at your kitchen table with nothing more than a notebook. No calculator, no judgment, no pressure to solve anything today. Just curiosity. You begin writing down the places your money usually goes: groceries, rent, gas, coffee, streaming subscriptions, insurance, the occasional dinner with friends, the birthday gift you forgot to budget for, the small purchases that barely seemed noticeable when they happened. You're not trying to decide whether any of these are good or bad. You're simply making the invisible visible. There's something surprisingly calming about naming things. When something remains vague, our minds often make it feel much larger than it really is. But once we give it a name, it becomes something we can actually understand. It's a little like walking into a room that's been dark for hours. Before the light comes on, every shadow feels uncertain. Once the light appears, the furniture hasn't changed, but the fear often has. Money works in much the same way. Clarity doesn't instantly solve our problems. It simply replaces uncertainty with information. And information is much easier to work with than imagination. After you've written everything down, another gentle question becomes possible. Which of these expenses are responsibilities? Which ones change from month to month? And which ones are choices? Notice that we're not calling them good choices or bad choices, only choices. That difference matters. Because the moment we begin labeling ourselves as irresponsible or disciplined based on every purchase, we're back in the cycle of judgment instead of understanding. Maybe you enjoy buying fresh flowers every week. Someone else might think that's unnecessary. But perhaps those flowers brighten your home after long work days and remind you to slow down. Maybe they're worth it. Maybe they aren't. Only you can really answer that. On the other hand, perhaps you've been paying for 3 streaming services you rarely use anymore. Not because you consciously chose them, because life became busy and you simply forgot. That doesn't make you careless. It makes you human. Life has a way of collecting little commitments without asking whether they still belong. Sometimes our finances need the same gentle decluttering our homes occasionally do. Not because owning things is wrong, because making space often brings relief. Something else begins to change when we stop judging every dollar. We become more intentional. Instead of asking, "Can I afford this?" we might quietly ask ourselves something different. What role will this play in my life? Will this matter next month? Will I still be grateful for this a year from now? These questions aren't meant to stop us from enjoying life. Quite the opposite. They're invitations to spend in ways that actually reflect what matters to us. Because money is never only about money. It's one way we express our priorities. Sometimes we spend because something brings genuine joy. Sometimes we spend because we're lonely. Sometimes because we're exhausted. Sometimes because buying something feels easier than sitting with a difficult emotion. None of these make us bad people, but becoming aware of them gives us something valuable: choice. Without awareness, our habits quietly make decisions for us. With awareness, we begin making those decisions ourselves. And awareness doesn't require perfection. It only asks us to notice. There's another quiet shift that can make life feel a little lighter. Many of us rely almost entirely on motivation when it comes to managing money. We tell ourselves that next month we'll be more disciplined. We'll remember every due date. We'll transfer money into savings. We'll keep track of every expense. Sometimes we succeed for a little while. Then life becomes stressful. We get tired. Something unexpected happens. And suddenly the entire system falls apart because it depended on us feeling motivated every single day. That's a heavy expectation to place on anyone, especially people who are already carrying so much. Maybe instead of asking ourselves to become more disciplined, we could ask a kinder question. What could make this easier? Perhaps one bill could be paid automatically. Perhaps a small amount could move into savings the day your paycheck arrives, before you even have to think about it. Perhaps reminders could live in your calendar instead of only in your memory. These aren't shortcuts. They're acts of self-support. We often admire people who seem incredibly organized, but many of them aren't relying on exceptional self-control. They're relying on systems that quietly support ordinary human forgetfulness. There's something comforting about that, because it reminds us we don't have to become different people before our lives become more manageable. We can simply build environments that work with who we already are. Our lives become easier not because we've become stronger, because we've become wiser about our own limitations. There's no shame in needing reminders, no shame in automating routine decisions, no shame in making life a little easier for yourself. In fact, that may be one of the healthiest forms of self-respect. We stop expecting ourselves to perform perfectly under constant pressure. We begin designing lives that leave room for being human. And perhaps that's what financial peace really looks like. Not controlling every dollar with perfect precision, not never making mistakes, not always choosing correctly, but creating enough clarity that money slowly becomes less frightening. Enough simplicity that we no longer avoid opening the app. Enough understanding that our financial decisions begin reflecting our values instead of our fears. Little by little, the noise starts to quiet. The uncertainty softens. And we realize that peace wasn't waiting for us at some magical number in the future. It was waiting inside the small, ordinary habits that helped us stop fighting ourselves. Because in the end, managing money isn't really about learning to control every outcome. It's about learning to care for ourselves with the same patience, honesty, and steadiness that we would offer someone we deeply love. And that kind of change rarely happens all at once. It happens one gentle decision at a time. Once we can see our money clearly, something else starts to shift too: the way we think about spending itself. There's a simple question worth carrying with you the next time you're about to buy something. Not, can I afford this? Something a little gentler. Do I need this? Do I love this in a way that will still matter to me a year from now? Or is this just a flicker of a feeling that will probably fade by next week? There's no right answer here, just honesty. And on the other side of spending, there's saving, which carries its own quiet myth. Many of us believe more is always safer. But there's a point where saving stops being protection and starts becoming a different kind of avoidance. Money that just sits untouched isn't wrong exactly, but it isn't really living either. Maybe the goal was never to hoard enough to feel safe forever. Maybe it's to have just enough of a cushion to feel steady, and then let the rest of our energy go toward the life we actually want. There's a story that says this more gently than we ever could. A woman who built a thriving business, who worked long hours for years until she felt a quiet pull to slow down and spend more time with her husband. She didn't fully understand why at the time, she just listened to it. A little over a year later, he passed away suddenly. In the middle of her grief, she said something worth sitting with for a long time. That all of it, the budgeting, the saving, the working, was never really about the money itself. It was always about what the money was meant to protect. Time, connection, the people we love. She said, maybe we already have enough. Not enough to buy anything we could ever want. Enough to stop white-knuckling our way through life, waiting for some future number to finally let us breathe. So where does that leave us? Maybe it leaves us here, realizing our relationship with money was never really only about the money. It was about safety, about shame, about wanting to feel like we're doing okay and being quietly terrified that we're not. None of this means the numbers don't matter. They do. But understanding ourselves has to come first. Because once we understand why we avoid what we avoid, why we spend the way we spend, why we save the way we save, the numbers stop feeling like a verdict on who we are. They just become information. And information is a lot easier to work with than shame. Here's the deeper lesson underneath all of this. Money problems are so often mislabeled as discipline problems, when really they're understanding problems. We don't need to become a different, stronger, more disciplined version of ourselves to get better with money. We need to slow down long enough to understand the fear underneath the avoidance, the shame underneath the silence, and the very human reasons we do what we do with what we have. And once we understand that, we don't need a perfect system. We just need a next honest step. So if there's one small thing to carry with you from today, let it be this. Tonight, pick one envelope, one statement, one number you've been quietly avoiding. Just look at it. Not to fix everything at once, just to prove to yourself that it's not as unbearable as it felt in your head. That's enough for today. We'd love to know, what's one thing about money you've been quietly avoiding lately? Tell us in the comments below, gently, honestly, however you want to say it. Sometimes just naming something out loud is the first real step toward changing it. And if this sat with you the way we hoped it would, consider subscribing to Slow Down with Brenda. It helps us keep making this kind of space for you, week after week. We'll see you next time. Slow down. You're doing better than you think.